We talked about Turkey in details last time. Today I want to talk about these three countries. And as many of you have already identified, these are new countries. I want to, of course, make something very obvious. When I say new countries, it doesn't mean that there were no people living there. Of course, Iraq is the oldest settled civilization in the world, older than ancient Egypt. But the interesting thing, as you can see here, is the following, that the modern state of Iraq is a modern concoction, is a modern creation that comes out of the First World War. Before then, when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was actually three provinces. Basra in the south, Baghdad in the middle, and Mosul in the north. These are actually not exact borders. The Ottomans never drew borders between their provinces. And this is interesting to think about. Whether it is Egypt or Syria or Palestine, especially when it comes to Palestine, when you think about what were the borders of Palestine under the Ottomans, what were the borders of Mosul under the Ottomans, it is important to think of the following, and this is crucial. It's how you imagine space, how maps were drawn. These are modern maps about a pre-modern time. The Ottomans did not draw it this way. If you were an Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, okay, and your troops captured Baghdad, I think so that's an important thing. But how do you think the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul imagined Baghdad? This is before the internet, this is before mobile phones, this is before all these means of communications. This is before even these maps were designed. So how do you think he imagined Baghdad? Any thoughts?
Tribes that were there.
Tribes that were there. He would think about the people rather than borders. What else? What else would, I mean, this is something new that he had acquired in his empire. So how would he think about it?
The geography, like hills or lakes or...
He would think about what he had heard about, what these provinces are famous for in terms of natural terrain. So hills, mountains, or deserts, or rivers, or what else?
Climate.
Climate? Okay.
Religion, because it contributes a lot to
Sorry?
to religion. He thinks about
Religion?
because it's going to contribute as to how the province is ruled.
Yeah, the religious significance of whichever province.
The market, like the local economy.
Markets.
Products, what they get from them, silk.
Products.
Military.
The three provinces are called Mosul, Baghdad, Basra. Named after cities. Cities. That's, that's the main way of imagining. So, of imagining the province. It's in cities that markets are located. It's in cities that artistic production happens. It's in cities that the economic activities take place. It's in cities that religious activities and religious production take place. The terrain is important, the hills and the rivers and so on, but the cities, and it's interesting that this is why the term Mahrusa, the protected city of Cairo, Mahrusat Baghdad, Mahrusat Sham, because the Ottoman Sultan thinks of himself as responsible for protecting these cities. These are the gems, these are the jewels in his empire. This is where things happen. And accordingly, when you think about cities as the main focal points of the provinces, the province of Baghdad is actually centered around Baghdad. So it is Baghdad and its hinterland, its lands around it, the tribes and the trade routes and the activities taking place, of course, inside the city, but also surrounding the city. And in that sense, I claim, and many people claim, when the Ottomans thought about space, they thought about space, if you can imagine it this way, as concentric circles around Baghdad. So there is Baghdad and its sphere of influence, and Basra and its sphere of influence. And of course, they overlap because, so do not think these are modern imaginations of where the borders were, but there were no borders between these provinces. They hover around in a rather vague way. Yes, Chester.
But wasn't the Sultan forced to think about that in a different way in the 19th century, and it hadn't been that case before, because it was more about kind of tribal and family, tribal relations and stuff like this. It was like after the convention of European capitals in the 19th century, or opening the markets, that they were given some power, and it was sort of like in one of the readings we read, I think, yeah, he kind of suggests that for Palestine.
Yes, but I didn't get the beginning. I misheard the beginning of your sentence.
Just that it was the Sultan didn't think of them necessarily as being cities or something like that. That was a recent development, more recent development.
But they thought of them as
perhaps this region that was within their control, but less about this kind of centralized city. Less of a.
I don't know. I think it's a again, if you think about the city not only as a city, but a city with its hinterland surrounding it, and what takes place there. But I don't want to belabor the point. I just want you to think about how. I mean, my main point here is that there was no province called Iraq. There were 3 provinces, each centered around one important metropolitan center, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, each one having its own governor, its own different mechanism of government on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. So this is one thing. The second is that these 3 provinces are not homogeneous in terms of their ethnic composition or their religious affiliation. There are Shias and Sunnis. There's a sizable Jewish community, especially in Baghdad. There is a sizable Kurdish, that's a linguistic and ethnic rather than religious. Most Kurds are Sunnis, but they do not speak Arabic, so it's a different ethnicity up there, especially in the north of Mosul, very close to Diyarbakir, which is predominantly Kurdish. It's a different and a sizable Christian minority as well. So Christians, Jews, Sunnis and Shias, Arabs and Kurds living in 3 provinces, all part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire goes to war, it is defeated, and the story we know. The question is what to do with this region. As we know, a mandate is given to Great Britain to rule a new country called Iraq that would be composed out of these 3 provinces. The question is where the capital will be, Basra, Baghdad, or Mosul, what the borders would be, what the political system would be, and how to manage it. This was a very hard nut to crack, and the person who found the solution to it is this woman, an amazing figure in the history of the region, an amazing figure in the history of the British Empire, and definitely of Iraq. Also a very tragic figure, fascinating woman, Gertrude Bell, similar in character to Lawrence T. Lawrence. Similar background, died older, but in a much more dramatic way. She also studied Arabic in Oxford, where she took a first in 1887. Her uncle was a minister, that is an ambassador, British minister in Tehran, neighboring Tehran on the east. So she goes to visit him immediately after she finishes her degree. She also roams around in the area. She goes to Arabia in the south. She goes to Palestine. She goes to Syria. And she takes beautiful pictures. Some of the most amazing photographs of the region, some of the earliest pictures that we have are taken by this woman. Interestingly, and she also wrote copiously. She wrote a memoir. She also wrote a daily journal, and she was an avid letter writer, especially to her father. So she did not produce what T.A. Lawrence produced, this big fat book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which is what he produced, but she was an equally prolific writer. If you're interested in her, there's a fascinating website done by the University of Newcastle in England, where they have her papers, her photo albums, her memoirs, and the letters to her father, digitized with an amazing search engine. Those of you who are interested in another class to write a paper on an interesting woman, interesting character, who shaped, not single-handedly, but considerably alone, the borders of Iraq. You'd see her writing a letter to her father saying, I'm meeting with tribal sheikh, whoever, to decide on what to do with the borders. I'm having tea with, I don't know, I mean, this is a very patriarchal society at a time when, you know, there's a rebellion happening in the region, and she is masterminding. She understands the language, she understands the history, she has enormous self-confidence, she knows everybody, more so than most people do. She has a line of communication with London via many people, and she is given a chance to write an exhaustive survey of Iraq, and that is what attracted the attention of people in London. And they started referring to her to tell her, so tell us what to do. Before continuing the story of what to do, let me also say that she was also, like many of these people, was she a spy? Of sorts, yes, of course she was a spy, but more so than, you know, your typical mediocre spy. She's an author, she's a writer, she's a photographer, and she is a decision maker. But she was also an avid collector of antiquities. And interestingly, and to her credit, she did not siphon off the amazing antiquities of ancient Iraq to the British Museum. She was one of the earliest British administrators who said that those artifacts found in Iraq should remain in Iraq. In fact, the Iraqi National Museum, the one we saw looted when the Americans invaded Iraq, she's the founder of that museum. So she's the one who put in place not only the idea, but the actual museum and the administrators of the museum. So she's an amazing, amazing character. I don't know all of her story, but she was a very also reclusive woman, enormous self-doubt, deeply anxious person. And in a bout of depression, she took sleeping pills on the 12th of July, 1926, and killed herself. So it's a very tragic end of an amazing, amazing life. But back to Iraq, the mandate is imposed. There is, as we've seen elsewhere in the region, a huge rebellion against the idea of the mandate, specifically against the idea of a British mandate. The tribal population in Iraq, especially around Baghdad, rose in June of 1920 in a huge rebellion against increased British presence. And the people in London are wondering what to do. We've been given a mandate, we don't know what to do. So she's the one who started thinking, okay, why don't we do something we've tested in Egypt, as we'll mention. That is, we maintain British presence, but not direct. That's costly. We will find someone who can do our bidding. This principle of indirect rule, we bring someone who can be malleable to our wishes. And the question is who? And of course, we know the answer. She's the one who suggested, what about Faisal? Do you remember this hot potato we didn't know what to do with, who was initially put as king of Syria in Damascus. The French kicked him out. So she said, what about taking him and making him king of a newly established country in Iraq? And this is what she did, and they installed Faisal as king of Iraq in 1921. The question is how to make sure that this king will be malleable to us. And this took a long time of negotiations until finally in 1930 a treaty of friendship was signed between the newly created country of Iraq and Great Britain, whereby Great Britain would reserve to itself the right to protect this newly created country. In other words, exactly what happened in Egypt, your defense is not in your hands, which meant that the British had the right to establish 2 air bases in Iraq and the right to impose their own politics on the foreign policy of Iraq. So the poor guy, Faisal, is a very unfortunate, is a very dramatic figure, another very dramatic figure. He starts his career, as we've seen in the movie, with high hopes, an amazing moment in the history of the region, and hopes that were dashed in a very brutal way. He ends up with a country that he doesn't understand. He ends up with a country that is not homogeneous ethnically. He ends up in a country that is very difficult to govern. He's established a king, but he has to make an enormous effort to sell the idea of monarchy to his new subjects, and a foreign monarchy at that. And by the way, this in itself is not a very weird concept. If you look around in the ethnic composition of most European monarchies in the 19th century, most of them were not from the countries they ended up ruling. That's not very awkward. Ultimately, at the end of the day, he still speaks Arabic, much better than many of the European kings who didn't even speak the language of the countries that they were ruling over. But it's a difficult country. Difficult country to control because of its difficult homogeneous population, because of its rebellious nature. They were rebelling, the tribes are rebelling against the central authority of Baghdad. In addition, the British are coming and saying, you do this, you don't do that. And to top it all, the curse of oil. So let me say a couple of things about oil in the region, which is something, a theme we'll be touching upon in extension later. Now, what makes the discovery of oil in the region interesting is things that happened outside the region. So let me say a couple of things about what happened outside the region and then what happened inside the region. The first, of course, is the famous story of the development of the automobile, which meant that mechanized transport is now possible, and there is a demand for gas, demand for petrol. Most of this demand is already supplied for by American, the US oil fields, so there's no problem as such. The First World War is an amazing development with regards to the history of oil, because this is the first mechanized war in history. And there's an amazing, interesting chapter during the war when the Germans are advancing on Paris, and the French authorities do not have enough time to put these men on railways and to send them to the troops. So the mayor of Paris summons all the taxi cabs of the city and starts conveying thousands and hundreds of thousands of troops to the front. A very famous story. The mayor is called Gallieni, and if you go to Paris, there's a big street named after him, close to the Étoile, close to the Charles de Gaulle Square, named after him because he's the one who saved the city from being occupied by the Germans through this transport. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that this is about oil. You would not have been able, this is not coal in the locomotives of the trains, this is now petrol. And of course, airplanes. That's, very obvious. And the story we already talked about, this fateful plunge, as it is called in the history of oil, when Churchill decides to transform the Navy from relying on coal to relying on oil. The idea being that the internal combustion engine of these ships, if they rely on oil, it saves space. The space that you would use to put the coal in on the ship. It's cleaner, but most importantly, it is more energy efficient, which is translated into speed. Higher speeds on the high seas, extra 4 knots per the hour, and that is crucial in any naval combat. And that is the decision that Churchill takes, which is amazing, because the British Isles do not have oil. The British Isles are rich in coal. They do not have oil. But he makes this decision anticipating a confrontation with Germany on the sea, on the high seas. So this is the strategic thinking of these people at that time. He realizes that Britain doesn't have coal, but he doesn't have oil, but he nevertheless says, we need to make this transformation. We need to invest in building new machines for our ships, because we need these extra 4 knots an hour to win any naval combat. Where do we get the oil from? Iraq. Well, it's Iraq and Persia.
Wasn't it Kuwait?
Kuwait was, no. Initially it was, the first place where oil was discovered in commercial quantities in the region is in Persia. I'm trying to find a map. Well, you know where Iran is. So it's here. The eastern shore of the Persian Gulf, that is where in 1908, that is when the first large oil fields were discovered. Later on, as you can see here in Kirkuk, and that's where, that is the significance of this bulge here. When they were signing the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British already knew that significant amounts of oil were discovered in northern Iraq, and that is why, and that is why they insisted on having an access to Kirkuk, which is where the oil fields are. So that's again the imperial mindset, and eventually all of this was translated into a new company, with British control after the creation of Iraq as a country, the so-called Iraqi Petroleum Company. It's called Iraqi not because Iraq controlled it. It's called Iraqi because this is where the oil is. But the company is controlled by Britain. The majority of stakeholders are British. And that is how they managed to create this new country called Iraq. They put on its throne a king answerable ultimately to them. And the main and its external foreign policy is in British hands, and its defense, it's also in British hands, and its main resource is controlled by the British. This is the imperial mindset. This is what is called Britain's moment in the Middle East. This is a title of a very famous book by Elizabeth Monroe, speaking about how Britain established its hegemony in the region after the end of the First World War. It's these kinds of machinations and these kinds of treaties and constitutions that we find throughout the region. We'll continue the story of Iraq, of course, later on, but do you have any questions about, I mean, this is the overall picture of how modern Iraq is put in place.
I think I missed something. Gertrude Bell, was she the one who suggested to put all three provinces together? And
Yes.
she was ultimately the one who drew the border?
Yes. Yeah. Well, ultimately, it's people in London. Mostly, it's Churchill, but it is based on recommendations, based considerably on recommendations that she presented to people in London. She's our man in Baghdad.
She's not considering the oil, but she's not considering her.
I'm not sure. Frankly, I don't know. I don't think so. I think she is the expert on tribes and tribal coalitions and where people are, and she knows what's happening in Jordan. She also knows what's happening in Arabia with the Sauds. So she's thinking about these kinds of forces more so than oil. I suspect, frankly, I don't know enough.
And then anecdotally, is that not BP?
Yes, eventually. That's BP, yes. British Petroleum. Yes, no.
Was Iraq an artificial country?
Sorry?
Was Iraq an artificial
Artificial
state?
state? It's a good question. That's a good question. But what do you mean by it? What do you mean by this? By the question?
Yeah, I mean, they took certain parts that don't, that are not homogeneous, and they put them in this boundaries. They're in this. Because northern Iraq and southern Iraq, they're not the same. They don't have the same language, culture.
What do you think? Let me put it back to you.
They will try to incorporate as much oil needs as they can in one country.
But what's your answer to Nohan's question? The question is Iraq an artificial country?
Yes, it's made by Britain.
Chester.
I think like there's other countries in the like in the Middle East that were became colonies that did have a history that weren't artificial, but like these ones, these Mexico, were certainly artificial.
Speak up so that Nohan hears you at the back.
Well, okay, so I think that all states are artificial.
Speak up. Speak
up. All states are artificial because, they're imagined communities. And really, like Anderson would argue that in fact these borders are drawn; they are not there in nature, and what makes Iraq maybe more artificial than others is just the diversity in this space, and just it's a very forced state in a way because they are so diverse, and you have conflicts that emerged out of these artificial borders. But I would also agree with the claim that all nation states are artificial.
It's interesting. The word artificial. How else can you refer to what we are seeing? Artificial or arbitrary. You mentioned, yeah, imagined, natural. What other words what other adjective would you use? Artificial, natural, forced. Sorry? Fake. So, sorry? Practical. These are powerful adjectives. They have significant political implications. If you say a country is artificial or fake, then you can do away with it, without it. You know, we can dismantle it and build a more natural one. So this is a powerful claim to say this is an artificial state. Ultimately, Saddam Hussein used that same word to refer to Iraq, to Kuwait. He said this is an artificial state. Kuwait should have been the 19th province of Iraq. And the Kuwaitis didn't like that. So what did he do? He made it the 19th province. He invaded. So these words have implications. When you say a country is artificial, you can go and rectify the fakeness in it. When you claim a country doesn't exist, like the Zionists claim there's no Palestine, like Golda Meir, until she died, she said there's no Palestinian people. A people. There's no people. There are refugees. These are refugees, but they do not constitute a people. So these are we'll come to this later. These are very powerful claims. Now Malak mentioned a very interesting term, which is imagined. And that refers to a title of a book, a very famous book that I am sure at least some of you would have heard about, which is Imagined Communities. There's a very, very famous book by somebody called Benedict Anderson, published some 20 years ago, about precisely what we're talking about. Not Iraq, not the Middle East, but South Asia. That's his material. It's drawn from South Asia. And his claim is the following. Nationalisms and countries are not distinguished between each other on whether or not they are artificial or natural, but on the means with which they are imagined. And this semantic difference has become revolutionary in political science, in history. To say, as Malak said, all countries in some form are artificial. The question is, how are they imagined? And if you shift the analysis from artificialness to imagination, you open up amazing vistas and amazing ways of analysis as a political scientist, as a historian, as an analyst. Because imagination is more fertile. And it's basically about how people imagine themselves as belonging to a certain community. When I went to school, I was taught that we were all Arabs because we speak Arabic and we have common ancestry and we have a common religion. It's about the past. It's about blood. It's about ancestry. What Benedict Anderson is telling us is that nations and nationalism, this very strong feeling, is about the imagination. It's not about the blood in your veins. It's not about the language. It's not about terrain. It's not about territory. It's not about the government. It's about the imagination. And he mentions fascinating examples like the tomb of the unknown soldier, Abr Gundi Maghul, this institution where you go and stand in front of it and somehow imagine the tomb is empty. There's no one buried there. It's an unknown soldier. There's no one there. But somehow he stands for all of us. And the best tomb of the unknown soldier that he analyzes is the Vietnam War Memorial. You've been there. Can anyone describe it? In Washington?
The wall that's there, I absolutely. But it's not an unknown. It's got a list of names, so it's not exactly the unknown soldier.
It's very different. But the interesting thing, it's a memorial, and you go and walk in front of a wall, and it's a marble wall, so it's glittering and it's reflective, and you see your image on it, and on that wall is inscribed the names of thousands and thousands of victims of the war. And somehow, by walking in it and being engulfed by these names, you become, in a sense, one of them. So it's the exact opposite of the unknown soldier. But all of this, the impact and the power of the monument is on the imagination. It draws you in and tells you these people have died somehow for you. Or that you and they are part of the same endeavor. And that is how nations are imagined. The museum, that's another institution he analyzes. Not the museum that Gertrude Bell did, or maybe it is. The museum that exhibits the history of the nation in such a way as that when you walk through it, a subtle message penetrates in your mind that this is the history of your country unfolding in front of you, and you are marching down the history line, so to speak, and seeing the country's history unfolds in front of you. And that psychological impact on how you imagine your country's history is another institution that he analyzes. But the most interesting one he analyzes is something that we do every day without contemplating, which is newspaper, what he calls print capitalism. The fact that you wake up in the morning and open a newspaper and read whatever it is you read, forget the content, doesn't really matter, but the fact of the matter is that while you're doing this, somehow psychologically you understand, you assume correctly, there are millions of other people reading the same text at the same day. And that is how nations are imagined. This is why he called his book Imagined Communities. Not artificial, not fake, not even invented, which is another title of another famous book, Invented Traditions, but imagined communities. It's a breakthrough in political thought. You should read it. It's a beautiful book. It's a foundational book for modern understandings of nationalism. So all of this is to attempt to answer Nuhan's very important question. Is Iraq, are these countries artificial? This is why I started at the very beginning of the lecture by saying there is something called Iraqi society or Iraqi societies. This is a very old part of the world. It's not that the borders were drawn and people were shipped in and a new country called Iraq. That's not the case. Something is happening and a new state is being formed. It's very fraught with tensions within it. Whether or not it is artificial is a very good question, and we will have to leave it here and pick up this question when we talk about Jordan, our next country, and Egypt. And I would like to make the argument, I would like you to contemplate the same question when we think about Egypt. Is Egypt an artificial country? Of course, in a certain way, everybody will say, don't say this, this is anathema, we cannot say this. Egypt is the only country mentioned in the Quran, the whole, blah, blah, blah. But the question is, what is artificial about the modern state of Egypt? What is what is artificial about the modern map of the Middle East that we are analyzing? It's a key question, and it is underlying everything, not everything, but a lot of what we are encountering nowadays, the debates that we're having nowadays. I just want to end with one last thing. Does anyone know Amr Izzat? Journalist. Where does he write? Yes. He's someone who's much older than you are. He's one of the first bloggers in Egypt. way before, you know, the very beginning of blogging, about 8-9 years ago. And he's now in my mind, one of the most astute writers. He's only 30. I think he's a very, very clever writer. He wrote a very interesting article last week. He posted it on Facebook. And immediately Islamists jumped at him, referring to what? Referring to what we're discussing, referring to Sykes-Picot specifically. Sykes-Picot is the code word in modern Arab and Egyptian political language about Western conspiracy, about how artificial our countries are. Islamists in particular use this argument to say all of these regimes are artificial, and some say the countries themselves are artificial. There's nothing called Egyptian nation, there's something called a Muslim nation. We should do away with these countries, with these borders. These are artificial. We should go back to the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community. That's one argument. And the ammunition for it, Sykes-Picot. So it's not frivolous history that we're learning. This is key. Especially Sykes-Picot and Balfour Declaration. These are code words in modern Egyptian and Arab political language, political discourse about Western hegemony and nationalism and resistance to it in the Arab Spring. So we'll pursue this later on. We'll continue with our two countries next week.